Ohne NATO leben, Ideen zum Frieden. Internationales Podium. Chenoy, Indien.
Thank you all. I'm delighted and very honored to be here at this very important conference. And what I'm going to speak on is on NATO and international law and how it is, this whole new agenda is impacting Asia. So really, NATO's Agenda 2030 is to extend its global reach. And the priority in this is the Indo-Pacific, which is now a formal part of the agenda. The primary target is, of course, China, while the secondary target is Russia, which NATO believes is in a spot and is so appropriately being dealt with. Now, the steps which are being taken by NATO for the Indo-Pacific, for its reach in the Indo-Pacific, is one, the creation of the Quad, that is a quadrilateral security dialogue, which has Singapore, India, the US, and Japan. And Washington, of course, is seeking to expand this dialogue. Then there is the informal but overtly military alliance, the AUKUS, which is Australia, the UK, and US. And this is going to, bring greater militarization to Australia and to the Indo-Pacific through Australia. And third, they have a continuing and close traditional alliance with three other partners, that is Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. So therefore, my point now is that is this threat in the Indo-Pacific justified? And is the strategic fear that NATO have real? Clearly, the fear is over Taiwan on the South China Seas, and what they're arguing to keep Southeast Asia free to make strategic choices. But essentially, the strategy is to contain China and retain US primacy in this region. All of this actually can be negotiated diplomatically on the basis of international law instead of rising nuclearization and militarization, which cannot help any even of their stated objectives. The US defense spending is 3 times more than China, and the NATO combination is a force multiplier. This fear is actually increasing militarization of Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and the military budgets of almost all the countries here are gradually increasing, and for some increasing very fast. Now, China is asking for inclusive and collective security repeatedly, but at the same time, it prioritizes prosperity of its people over security, but yet it responds with a reciprocal militarization and flexing of muscles in the South China Seas. My second point then is, what is the reaction and positions of the Asian countries to NATO's Indo-Pacific strategy? This response is not continental. A few countries, that is really few, that is just Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and Fiji, they support NATO positions. A few others, like Myanmar and Laos, are with China, so they're supporting the Chinese position. But the rest, especially led by Malaysia and Indonesia, which are the emerging powers and leaders in the region, they have expressed very strong concerns about AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US trilateral security cooperation, and about the expansion of NATO and the new NATO documents which are coming out. Well, most of the ASEAN countries, the ASEAN regional bloc countries, the 10 countries, and the islands of the Pacific are concerned about NATO's strategic push and are resisting pressure to take sides. As you know, President Biden has been in Southeast Asia pressurizing countries to take the side of the US and NATO. But the overall view here is that NATO's hyperactivity in the region, the containment of China, the expanding of military and strategic alliances will lead to tensions. And I quote what these leaders have said, that it will not benefit anyone in this region. On the contrary, it would lead to a regional arms race, power projection, nuclearization, which had been avoided even during the First Cold War. Further, other countries outside Southeast Asia, like Central Asian republics and Mongolia, they also want to be equidistant and out of this superpower or great power rivalry. Then in South Asia, traditionally, for example, Pakistan was a very close partner of NATO. They took part in the ISAF operation of NATO in Afghanistan during the war against terror. This regime today is now disconnected with its own people on the issue of close relations with NATO. And moreover, whichever regime is in power in Pakistan will stand now in equidistant between NATO, the US, and China. They have built very close relations with China also. Then India, another major power in this region. It is a member of Quad, yet it did not bow to US pressure or Western pressure, and it remained neutral on the Russian aggression. Of course, it remained neutral because of its very close transactional national interest, concerns with Russia. As opposed, while they also said that they support international law and national sovereignty and condemn war, but nonetheless, Quad as a group is watching India and is disappointed because, again, within Quad, India has argued that they're interested in military exercises, but they would like to focus more on technical and trade cooperation and not want to be part of any confrontation or competition between US and the NATO on one hand and China on the other. So why are the Asian countries taking this position? It's similar to the position they took on Ukraine also. They shame and they name and then they step back. Most countries in Asia outside India have benefited from China's global rise, the infrastructure projects, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has extended communication. It had supported development in much of Asia, even though there are several related problems. There could be debt and inequality, etc. But nonetheless, there are also benefits. Further, most Asian countries have built valuable relations with both the US and China and gained from these. China has settled its border issues with several of its neighbors except with India. But there are issues about the South China Seas. But these, however, as Vietnam has also said, though they see the Chinese threat, they feel that these can be resolved diplomatically. So the majority of Asian countries do not see China as a threat, and they do not want to be drawn into a pattern of tension escalation or geostrategic rivalries. There is, moreover, a political consensus behind the Asian regimes on this issue. So while the regimes take this up, the people overall, even when they don't have the strength to say it, they support their regime on this balance between China and the US and don't want NATO to come into the region to destabilize this development. ASEAN especially wants to focus on domestic issues, and this external policy of balance has been enhancing their domestic image. Moreover, China is not part of any military alliance structure. It calls itself a developing country. It's part of the global South. It treats these countries as partners. It gives development assistance, foreign aid, which is unconditional. And it has also begun to focus on non-military security, on soft power, It is also beginning to trade in national currency, which is beneficial to all these countries. And therefore, none of the countries in Asia want to see these value and supply chains disrupted. Further, there is an understanding of the havoc that NATO caused in this region during the Cold War years. They set up the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, which worked here in Asia from 1955 to 1977. Of course, SEATO did not have a standing force, but they established a collective defense against communist China at that time and provided the rationale for large-scale US military intervention in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and those countries are suffering from this to date. And all of Asia can see this. My third point is on the issue of international law. Now, of course, the UN Charter that outlines international law commits states to the use of force only as a last resort after looking at a collective review and exhaustion of all alternatives along with the United Nations. However, NATO, while it backed the United States from 1954 onwards, the US in Asia took unilateral actions and interventions in Vietnam and elsewhere on its own economic and military capability. There were thus many procedural and other questions of international law that were bypassed, and they were backed by NATO. So as Richard Falk, for example, has argued in a huge volume on the United States and international law, where he says really that the US method is, the approach to negotiations is that it seeks victory at the negotiating table only when it becomes unattainable at the battlefield. The second issue on international law, besides this unilateralism, the fact that Russia is also violating international law in the same way in the instance of Ukraine, the US model. So Russia has easily copied that. The second is the stake of the Indo-Pacific and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that is UNCLOS, which has 168 parties, but here also the US has taken on the right to oversee and unilaterally interpret the UNCLOS. And the ASEAN region has been arguing that they want to develop their own code of conduct with China on the South China Sea, but this has not progressed that much. So they're also to blame. So NATO, my fourth and almost final point, is that NATO is the arm for the US aims of power, primacy, predominance, preeminence, basically unipolarity. But in Asia, unipolarity is now seen as being outdated. The US interventions and wars in Lebanon, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq are not seen sympathetically by the regimes and the people in Asia. Now, Asia today is very different to the one that US forces dominated over till the 1970s. The US really dominated over the land and skies of Asia through the 70s. But today, the US and NATO policies of containment, exclusion, targeting, bandwagoning, the hubs and spokes and threats are not really working in Asia, which all these countries, despite all their differences and their problems, they don't see a reversal to a multipolar world. Asian countries are full of internal crises. There is a rise of xenophobic nationalisms. There is minority bashing. There are internal oppressions. Democracy is either being hit or it has not developed and it is not deepened. But all this needs to be resolved democratically on their own. militarization and these geostrategic games will further hamper the Asian states. So in conclusion, and lastly, I would argue that civil society and experts in Asia oppose NATO's entry into the Indo-Pacific. Wherever they have the freedom to say so, they are saying so. But the minimalist position across Asia, from regimes to political parties to social movements, and wherever they can speak up, is for neutrality, which ideally should be to adhere to international law, move towards non-alignment, and the common security proposal as outlined by experts, some of whom are present here today. Thank you very much.
Schreiben Sie uns für Kritiken, Anregungen und Fragen kongress@frieden-links.de. Dieser Beitrag wurde vom YouTube-Kanal Der Rote Platz unterstützt.